Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. For all of you in the audience, this is day 2 at FC Build. For those of you who've just joined us from the talk with Nikesh Arora, CEO of Palo Alto Networks, thank you for continuing on the cybersecurity track. We have two fantastic CISOs here today in Sean Colfin and Caleb Seema. But before we get into the talk and get into Sean and Caleb's backgrounds, let me just briefly introduce Foundation to those of you who are joining us for the first time at the conference. Foundation is an early stage venture firm. We're based out here in the Bay Area. We invest primarily in enterprise and fintech companies. We typically lead rounds at the very, very early stages in startups, seed and Series A primarily. And then we continue on in the journey in these companies over a very long period of time. We've been doing this since 1995 and are currently investing our 10th fund. My name is Sid Trivedi. I'm one of the partners here at Foundation, and I focus on and lead cybersecurity and IT investments here at the firm. And I'm excited to have two close friends with me today. So, to get things started, Sean and Caleb, could you both briefly introduce yourselves to the audience and tell us a little bit about the size of the security programs that you run and the number of people on your team? Sean, maybe if we could start with you.
Yep, sure. Thanks for having me here today, Sid, and just glad to join you and Caleb and look forward to this discussion. Just Sean Calfin, Discover Financial Services. We're a Fortune 200 company focused on primarily the credit card that you're familiar with, second largest student loan provider, and also run a payment network where Apple Pay, 60% of Bank of America debit, Goldman Sachs Marcus runs on the payment rails and network. About the security organization, roughly about 300 folks, full-time employees, and everything from what you would expect, the governance strategy to operations to engineering and architecture across our product teams. And then, of course, the engineering alignment with our business products, whether it's our card and payment and network. So really glad to be here and look forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Sean. Caleb?
Caleb Seema. I'm the Chief Security Officer over at Robinhood. The security team size is around 120 or so as it stands today, but I am growing this team rapidly. We have a lot of work to do inside of our company. We do everything from product security, privacy, down the line. One other area that's interesting about our team here is we're also an engineering team, so we build and manage a lot of the critical security services that customers interact with in our application. So we are also an engineering team, not just a security team. I've been at Robinhood now for about 8 months or so. So most people would say that's fairly new, but in Robinhood years, that's like 3 years. So I feel like I've been at the company for a while.
And in CISO years, that's also 5 years, probably.
That's right. So I'm like only 3 years away from retiring, Sid. So,
so Sean, let's get things started. Caleb is at a fintech company. You're at a financial services company, and maybe it'd be helpful for you to explain what it's like to be at a large financial services company. You've been at 3 of them, Discover today, but before that, Barclays, and before that, Freddie Mac. You also serve on the board of the FSISAC. What's the difference in the role, being the CISO at a large financial services company with the heavy regulatory impact that you might have? And do you feel, one of the things I hear from founders all the time is that, financial services companies are so hard at adopting new software. Do you feel that that's true? And what can founders do better there?
Yep. Thanks. And I'd say it depends. And what I've enjoyed about being with some large financial institutions is just the ability to drive impact at scale. But it does have its challenges. As you mentioned, heavy regulation. Some days I feel like I'm in regulatory purgatory, but some aspects of it is necessary. As you reflect on the financial crisis with murky assets such as collateralized debt obligations. So we need to have some regulation, but what is that right polarity that we'll need to navigate through to ensure that we can still have and achieve velocity, but while still ensuring a secure foundation in the financial infrastructure? I would submit that there is just the administrative burden in a large, in many cases, bureaucratic organization. But while a lot of FIs have been slower to adopt new technology on a whole, I do think that there's been a shift where many organizations, such as the ones I've been fortunate to have been a part of, are created really innovative, like, hey, just test and learn labs, design partnerships. And what I've found with through those design partnerships, this really creates, it really supports, it's a win-win for the design partner, but it enables us to have tailored, innovative solutions to our problems. So where founders can glean real-world feedback at scale and drive growth, having some of those brand names to help drive that acceleration, but also backed by, hey, if it's been tailored, it can scale in a large organization. And this partnership also helps us achieve some of our unique use cases. So I guess tying that off, I would say it's not necessarily the large organization itself. It really depends on the teams and the engineers, finding the right folks and the right technology leaders who are thinking forward, who are not just, hey, I'm hitting the safe button by going with a big box vendor that's probably doesn't do the job very well, but I'm thinking about how can I solve unique and complex challenges that are fine-tuned and tailored to the problems that I'm facing. And then also bringing in my own engineering team to help have a hand in that roadmap and designing some of these solutions that are tailored to our needs, which also supports the founders. So at the end of the day, I really think it's the people and the technology leaders. There are going to be some that are averse, but I would spend time focusing on those who are leaning forward and thinking about these technology challenges in a unique way.
And what is the kind of the unique trait? Is it that, hey, they have a digital innovation lab, or what do you recommend founders look for to try to figure out who are these innovative financial services companies and the innovative security teams in those companies?
Yeah. I would submit, it's part of, I think it's multifaceted. First, it's doing your due diligence. Who are the leaders? And I mean, I'm pretty sure you could do a canvas across some of the Fortune 100 or 500 and get a view of who are the leaders out there that are really driving differentiating change or executing against their transformation. Looking at just the companies themselves, who's actually taking a multi-cloud strategy and looking at scaling infrastructure, building resiliency, innovating with new products that they're trying to compete with the fintechs of the world, right? That's kind of our challenge. We compete with our large competitors, and we need to maintain that share. But also, we have some cooperation with our fintech partners, where we need to innovate to keep pace with smaller startups. But also, hey, we allow them, hey, come partner with us and run our rails, and you don't need to build out that infrastructure. So I think a lot of it's just due diligence on the leaders and the market space in those companies, and who's really pushing the bar.
Yeah, it's an excellent point. And if I could add one thing to what Sean just mentioned, I do think that when you get onto a call with a customer as a founder, you should spend the first 10 to 12 minutes of that call. Let's assume it's a 30-minute call, asking the customer a set of questions to try to understand, is this technology worth even selling to the customer? I think many founders come in and they assume that the customer is excited about an opportunity, and they just assume, okay, well, every opportunity is going to work. With each customer, you should be willing to say, hey, this may not be the right fit for us. As a founder, you should figure that out too. Caleb, you're going to add something.
Yeah, I was going to add something because I've heard both extremes of where the founder comes in or the salesperson comes in and just straight out pitches, and then I've heard the other extreme. And so this is what I want to make sure that founders also understand is, and don't come into the conversation and only ask questions.
Yeah.
Right. There's a balance between you got to come in and you got to say, hey, whoever you're talking to, this is who we are. This is what we focus on. And here's the kinds of problems that we're trying to solve. And then kind of go into some of the questions, because I've also had, people come in and just be like, tell me what problems you have. And I'm like, listen, I've got 1,000 problems. So that's not a good, well, what's your top 10 problem list? I'm like, that's going to take too long. Why don't you tell me what you're interested in, what you try to solve for? And then that can help me narrow down my scope. And then we can kind of get into more of a Q&A. And also, by the way, just for the founders, there's a little bit of trust, right? You also have to have a little bit I'm just not going to tell you all of the things that are going on. I also need a little bit of dialogue with you around what you're trying to do, what are you dealing with, what are your challenges that you want to solve. And so there's got to be a little bit of back and forth before you get some of that. So that's just my my add-on to that.
When you look at it, Caleb, I mean, my assumption is a lot of sales calls that you've done over the years have been about 20 to 30 minutes. How much of time do you think should be dedicated to actually talking about Robinhood's problems and experiences as they pertain to that startup versus the startup presenting itself?
Well, so first of all, generally speaking, Sean can speak as well, but if you have 30 minutes with me, I'm already interested, right? So I would have done enough due diligence to sit there and say, okay, this is a problem that interests me, and therefore I want to find out more about it, right? So the number one thing you probably don't need to do is run through 15 minutes of slideware on the problem. I'm talking to you, I need to know more about what you're doing about the problem, or maybe even unique angles to the problem that you are solving, right? And don't spend too much time on it, because it's like, I get all of that. I get the market. I get hackers. I get that people get breached. Like, none of that matters to me. What I care about is, what is your unique approach to solving the problem space that you're in? And so, go ahead, Sean. I'll pass it. I know you're
I mean, 100%. I'm sure Caleb as well has. We get 1,000 emails a day, right? And there's so much. As we look at how do we calibrate the time and running the org, driving the engineering, everything internally, let alone that roadmap. And so, how do we ensure that they hit it on the head, where we're going to have a view of what our challenges are, and that's what's going to drive the discussion. And the part on the trust, I think trust capital goes a long way, where most of these, I would submit, a lot of these engagements are now from, whether I'm getting a reference from Caleb or someone like Sid, someone who I already have a trusted relationship to say, you know what, you should take a look at these guys, and that's where have that discussion and engagement. And that's been really that's really been the preponderance of the engagement we had, as opposed to, hey, just sifting through 1,000 emails.
Yeah, that's a great point.
But by the way, we're getting into this pretty early, because can I go into the complaining of what you should
not
do?
Yet,
or
not
we'll
yet.
Wait.
Before we get to complaining, because I'm sure founders are going to start complaining, and we'll get questions. And by the way, founders, if you have a question, not a complaint, but if you have a question for Sean and Caleb, please do put it on the comment section. I'll try to weave them in.
If you have complaints, put
complaints
them in the comment
too.
Let's take them.
Yeah, don't limit them.
Complaints too. You're unhappy about your Discover card. You can put it in comments, and Sean will try to remediate the problem.
How about complaints against us, not necessarily our company? That's probably
yeah.
So I'm going to move things around a little bit. Caleb, Sean talked a lot about large financial services companies, and you worked at Capital One, so it's not like you haven't had that experience. But today you're at Robinhood, which is a large fintech company. It has the existing financial services and some of the regulation, but it also has technology very much enabled into the process and is much newer. And you joined the company, as you mentioned, 8 months ago, right before the IPO happened. And obviously you went through that IPO event earlier this year. What were the first 2 or 3 things that you did when you joined as this pre-IPO CISO into Robinhood?
Well, I mean, I think I'll be pretty high level, but at the end of the day, you do what you're going to do in every time you start a new job. You've got to go in and you've got to assess and figure out, where are we, what's our level, what's our maturity, and get a little bit of finger in the air. Where are really major areas that we've got to be concerned with? And then, of course, look at the sort of major areas, and then do your best to start pushing in really good initiatives to start covering where we're missing and where we're lacking. When it comes to things like, I'll be very, very practical here. Like when you're going to IPO, there are just real practical standards, right? There's obviously for certain companies, there's what are our controls and what's our maturity and where we are. But I want to go a little bit more tactical and more basic. If we get DOSed, is that really a threat, right? Because when you go IPO, okay, you're going to have a lot of eyeballs. You're going to have a lot of things you've got to worry about from a reliability perspective. So your number one is let's just make sure that doesn't happen. And how do we do that? What's our reliability at? make sure we're not pushing major changes, go through certain areas of freeze to make sure that we're good to go. I also think what benefited Robinhood, and I'll be frank here, is we kind of went through all of that before we went through the IPO. So Robinhood has its share of massive eyeballs and extraordinarily insane traffic heading towards us. And so we went through a lot of those growing pains before the IPO. And at the end of the day, the IPO itself was relatively benign. And so we had a lot of good controls in place. But also there's going to be a rise of phishing and a rise of those kinds of things kind of coming in. So you got to kind of take a look at that, where you see a lot of upticks on people saying, hey, during the IPO, you vested certain amount of shares. Like you get a lot of this kind of very targeted phishing around to employees around shares and prices and IPOs, which generally you won't see, but around that time frame, you see a lot of upticks. So actually not that complicated, pretty simplistic stuff. There's a lot more around just basic hygiene and structure, but that's too long to go into on this.
And were you spending a lot of time on people, or were you spending time on software? How were you allocating that time? Were you looking at, hey, I have these vendors, I have these products, or I'm missing, these roles and these individuals?
I will tell you this, this has nothing to do with the IPO. This just has to do with just joining as a CISO in a new organization. But you've got to get a little bit of understanding of where your gaps were. In Robinhood, our gaps was our team. Mm-hmm. We had a very, very small team. They're a really, really great team, super smart, super ambitious, but small. And we were in a state where there's a lot of reactivity. And so everything was on fire. We were covering a lot of different attack surface. And so the number one thing I focused on, Sid, in Robinhood specifically, again, this is different for every org, was people. Yeah. We had to build the team, and we had to get those people in as fast as we could. And so I really I let a lot of fires burn while I got in the right people in the door to make sure that we have a good foundation for what we need to do moving forward.
Yeah, it's a great point. Sean, you also joined Discover recently. Now, the difference that Caleb described, I'm sure, or maybe it was the same problem, but my hunch is that you already had a number of people on the security team when you joined. Where did you kind of allocate your time?
Yeah, so the first, actually, it's very similar to Caleb's experience, but I look at it, the first piece is where am I anchored from a governance and control kind of framework perspective. That's the foundation, especially when I think about traceability to our Fed, our OCC, our FDIC, all of the regulatory bodies, because that's what creates a lot of headache, whether you receive like MRAs or other kind of constraints that are laid upon you, for lack of a better term. So how do we ensure what's our overall risk environment from the company, and then taking a view of based on that risk and where do we see like the risks exposure to legal risk, direct financial loss, reputational risk, and regulatory risk, as I mentioned. So it's really covering down on those pieces. So from a foundational perspective, and then there's of course the talent, looking at whether do I have the right talent on staff, and then are they deployed in the right manner? Whether it's how do they engage with our product teams? We build our own products similar to Caleb as far as from a security engineering product team, but the same with our engagement with our product partners in the business units. What's that relationship like? And then of course in a large company, it's all the key stakeholders, spending time with our risk officer, my teammates that are head of engineering, head of app dev, and head of infrastructure, head of CHRO, and all of our other key stakeholders, and of course board, all of the relationship piece there is another critical component. So I would submit understanding the foundation. Where do you have capability gaps in your stack? Do you have the right level of telemetry? Do you have the right, as we think about, whatever investments that you have, what are the gaps, whether it's configuration, whether it's just true solution gap, is it a process gap? And then ensuring that, hey, how are we covering down on that? And again, I would submit the war on talent, as Caleb could probably attest to, as probably all of you as founders, can attest to, how do we ensure that we can retain our key talent while continuing to attract new talent?
Yeah. Questions are starting to come in. So I'm going to ask this question. I'm going to paraphrase it a little bit. Prakash asked a question, Caleb, to you. You mentioned trust. Effectively, and Sean reaffirmed this, hey, if you're a startup and you want to get connected with me or my team, go through a trusted network. Prakash's point is, well, what if you don't have that trusted network and you don't have the brand? What's the way that they get 30 minutes with Robinhood?
I would tell you this. First, I think most people try to get to the CISO, and that's actually the wrong thing to do. I won't speak for Sean, but I'll tell you, I don't know what's going on. I'll let my direct reports and the people who know better understand what the real problems are and where they need to go. And so I think that the first and foremost thing is CISOs get a lot of love. Everybody wants to go after the CISO. There are CISO events, there are CISO gifts, there are CISO who knows what's going on. Everybody tries to get to the CISO, when at the end of the day, for me, I'm not the one who makes the vendor decisions. It's my team that makes the vendor decisions. So if you want to get to the real problem and where the real issues are and the right people, start targeting not the CISO, right? Hold events for people that are less than maybe the direct reports to the CISO, maybe the people on the team. Let's say you're a detection and response vendor. Maybe what you want to do is you want to hold an event, an engineering event that's unique just to the engineers, responders, or the detection guys on the team. Go to the people doing the work, and that way you'll get your foot in a lot easier. And by the way, these guys don't get a lot of love. And so holding events where they can gather and they can communicate and targeting these, I think, is a really easy way to get, and there's a lot more. And at the end of the day, what will happen is if my team loves a vendor, it will come to me at some point. And at that point, it's not even my decision. They're just telling me, here's what's going on. I do some double checks. Great, sounds great, move forward, right?
Couldn't agree more. I mean, I look at it, our job as leading the security organization is to empower our people, provide top cover, remove roadblocks. And I couldn't say it any better. It's just letting our teams lead and spend time with those folks. It is lonelier for them than it is for us. And they're the ones making all the decisions, the directors and the engineering teams.
Yeah, it's a great point. It can't be reaffirmed enough. I think, Caleb, your point that the CISOs get all the love is a fair one. And I don't think as a community we have done enough for other subgroups. And those subgroups have been elevated just as the CISO role has elevated. The two of you spend time with your boards of directors at your two public companies, and so do the people who work directly under you and the people who report under them. They've also moved up, and they also do have more and more budgetary authority. On that topic, for both of you, do your direct reports have access to budget? Maybe Caleb, if we could start with you, can they make a decision without your approval?
Yeah, so let me also kind of budget authority is an interesting question, right? Sort of what I think Sean and I were talking about a little bit earlier is, okay, if a direct report does or does not have an actual envelope at which they control, in all of fairness, I'll say in my organization, doesn't matter. If one of my guys says this is the product that we need in order to solve a problem, then I will support that. Right? They effectively do manage the budget, even if they're not the ones signing their name, right? And so when you say budget authority, in all fairness, I don't think it matters, right, in the right organization. However, in my organization today, they don't have specific envelopes because we're growing into that size of an organization. We're not there yet, but we will get there where, yes, they will have envelopes at which they're assigned, but again, doesn't make a difference, right? I've already got people from all over my teams that are saying, we need to go here, we need to get this vendor, we need to get this vendor. And as long as they've gone through our process, even though I'm the one, I'm not the decision maker. They've already spent the budget. That's their decision. They make that call.
Yeah. Similar. I have the overall stamp. I would say I'm the one who has to docu-sign the contracts and all of that. But it's the same concept with our team. My head of AppSec, my head of cloud, those folks, they evaluate the investments they have. I ask all our product owners, your product, all of the competitive space, and the roadmap for the next 3 years. And so as they look at, hey, this is what we're planning for 2022. These are the capability areas we need to invest in. We're going to need to run these types of POCs. We're going to allocate. This is what the rough BOM of this product suite or area looks like. These are the investments we're going to need to make, and we make that allocation. So when they're ready to submit it to say, we baked off these 3 products, we found this to be superior, hey, we're going to submit it for approval. So that's pretty much how we run it as well. Similarly, Caleb.
And for what it's worth, as an investor, I can say this because I've had a number of my companies sell to to large organizations before in the security teams. I have never seen a situation where a startup got approval from all of the direct reports and the relevant kind of sub-orgs, and the CISO shot down the deal. Or this, I see a lot of this happening. I'm sure the two of you have kind of gone through this process where one of my companies wins, quote unquote, wins the technical deal, and then some other competitor is able to kind of finagle their way to speak directly to the CISO. I've never seen that competitor win purely on that. That the CISO says, oh, no, let's cancel this whole other idea and let's go with this other vendor. Caleb.
But can I tell you something that's the direct opposite? I have seen several times where the CISO says, hey, what about this vendor? And the team shuts it down.
Well, yeah, that's a great point. That was my last example, right? Which is that, a company wins and then a competitor figures out a way of going directly to the CISO to try to win the deal. That in itself, I think that the both of you have said this. I mean, you're not going to shoot down your entire teams if the teams are saying we should buy this solution over something else. It's just unlikely.
And in fact, there's even a little bit of opposite to this. So for example, if I suggest a vendor to solve a problem to the team, my team on the other end goes, okay, here we go again. Caleb's sending over the vendor. Like, we got to go look at it because Caleb asked, and like, okay, go look at this. Hey, Caleb, like, here's so like, you also got to understand a little bit of that, right? Like, I'm not going to be piping vendors down into my team because that's a waste of their time, right? If they've got problems to solve, there are times where it works well, but generally speaking, it doesn't work that way. So
we've talked a lot about vendor selection. I want to move topics along a little bit. Sean, I get this question from a lot of my companies, which is that should they sell to the federal market? And you have a unique viewpoint here because before your financial services roles, you held senior security leadership roles at both the DoD and the DHS. As CISO as well as deputy CISO in multiple organizations. What's your recommendation for a founder who's trying to decide, should they sell to the federal market? At what stage should they do it? At what point should they consider that market?
Yep. I would have, a few years ago, I would have recommended staying away for as long as possible until you're in much later stages of growth. And especially if you had to install something and a government baseline image or something like that, you'd be acquired by then. I do think today there is appetite just to increase, given the increased focus on cyber risk, the government really paying attention to try to improve attribution, making investments, even just looking at this, the National Defense Authorization Act, and that's going through Congress, the amount of money that they're investing in it. I think they've started to place emphasis on accelerating testing and investment in newer innovative tech beyond just the small little government innovation centers that they used, that really were just the only places where they would test out new things and it wouldn't go anywhere. Excuse me. While with many capabilities being more SaaS-based, I think that really starts to create grease the skids a little bit, where you might still need your SOC 2, Type 2, and other like basic certs, but you can start to get a little bit more velocity because you're not trying to go through the bureaucracy of installing something on the stack. You're consuming. So overall, I would say the bar is lower to compete in this space, but don't forget that it's still the government. It's not easy. But it's just a little easier than what it was. I don't think the approach, just to touch on that, is too much different than what we've discussed, what Caleb and I has discussed. It's still building relationships. It's understanding the mission of the agency, sharing how the solution can enable that mission to reduce risk, tackle new challenges, and of course that listening as well. So I think it's still the same steps that you would take with Caleb or I and our teams. I take that same approach.
So 2 follow-up points there. One, anything around stage of startup? Is there, hey, the startup has sold to this many customers or it has certain certifications? And then 2, is there a certain agency that's better?
Yeah. I would submit from a stage. I think because you still go through, hey, do you have the ability to scale? Do you have, so usually it's, I rarely see anything before like Series C, where there's a little bit more maturity, there's a little bit more scale. You see a lot there, and it's usually those later stages. It's very rare that I've seen, unless it's like in a small targeted use case, maybe somewhere in the intelligence community or something like that. You usually see some of these small one-offs, but very, very rare. I wouldn't anticipate that. From an agency perspective, I would focus. I think being part of like the defense and some of the DHS, I would submit in the broader government space. I would focus on agencies like a DHS, which have the DoD and some of these other federal agencies. They're playing the long game, right? It's a large administrative organization, but when we look at how dynamic some of the missions are and the challenges that they're facing, I would submit like going through where like DHS has their science and technology arm, and that's a great way to serve as an amplifier. And those organizations that are specifically look at newer tech, and most of these agencies are standing up arms to focus on emerging technologies to address and meet their missions. Just like the DHS Silicon Valley office, I think Melissa Ho is out there in your area and the West Coast, and she's in downtown San Jose in like the Secret Service building. But it's like she's out there as an engagement point to do initial screening and validation, but then plugging into other mission arms. So I think finding that coupling of the relationships and engaging, but also going through their external engagement office will help. Again, I'm not saying this is a rapid process, but it starts to lay the foundation.
Yeah, it's a great point. If one thing I could add to everything Sean said, I've also found that if you figure out a specific project that the agency is trying to solve, and you circle around that project, that can really increase pace. To the extent that my companies have been successful at the early stages selling to the federal government, it has been specific projects that the government has and a specific agency has with a very specific deadline. If you're able to kind of embed yourself in there and say, we're the best solution, that can really change the game in terms of pace. And some of those are public. I mean, Sean talked a little bit about DHS. On the DoD side, you have CIBRs, which are quite public. You can go and search them. That is a very big difference. Caleb, I want to move the topic along a little bit more. We cannot ignore this point, which is that in early November, Robinhood announced that it had experienced a data security incident where hackers had gained access to a list of, and you described this as 5 million email addresses. Could you share with the audience a little bit about what happened, and then what advice do you have for others in the industry, other security leaders, to ensure that we learn from this experience?
Yeah, I mean, we published a blog post that was pretty transparent around what happened. Effectively, without going into long stories about it, the attacker was a fairly sophisticated social engineer. They called the cell phone of one of our representatives. They social engineered the representative in a very, very good story to get access to their machine. And then from that point was able to both monitor and manipulate everything on this customer support representative's machine to get access to this type of data. And I'll tell you, it was a very expensive attack for the attacker, right? This was very sophisticated. They knew internal names, they knew hierarchical structures in a reporting organization, and they took a lot of time to really formulate this thing. Luckily, from our end, our detection was good and swift, and our quarantine was swift. And so we managed to be able to ensure that only one laptop, this one endpoint, was the farthest this person was able to get. But what was entertaining around all of this, of course, is the attacker asked and extorted for money. We went and negotiated with this individual, tried to get more information to find out what they had access to. And so a lot of that was very interesting during that process. So it was pretty simple, I'd have to say. At the end of the day, it's not great that we had to go through it, but if we did have to go through with one, knock on wood, that's the only time we've got to deal with this. It reminds me of a little bit of like, if you're ever a motorcycle rider, they always say you get into an accident when you're on a motorcycle. So what you do is hopefully it's a simple one. So a lot of people just purposely drop their bike to say, okay, I've had it, I'm done. Hopefully this is our dropping the bike. Like we've gone through it, we're done. Like knock on wood, we don't have to do it again. However, I think when it comes to sort of advice to others, other security people around this, like I'm going to be a little bit on the high level, but if you think of something like NIST, for example, a lot of people and companies, and this is actually for founders too, because you're going to have to hire your own security team. Many people spend a lot of their budget and time on identification and protection, right? Which is identify these flaws, identify your assets, and then build a lot of protection. And the issue is that if you make the assumption a breach is going to happen, which is, by the way, pretty safe to say. I mean, I think all of us at this point have been through it. So it's safe to say it's going to happen. There needs to be a lot more focus on the detection, response, recover side, right? And I think that there's not a lot of investment in that. So I think both to security people and to founders of companies, as they invest in like what they do to protect their companies, really take a lot of focus on investing in recovery, response, and detection, especially response and recovery, because you just have to assume it's going to happen. And, there's a good quote, I think, from another CISO friend, which is, a judge of a good security team is not whether you've prevented an attack, but how you responded to one. And I think that's a good thing to keep in mind.
Sean, I'm sure you've gone through experiences like this. What advice do you have for CISOs, and maybe adding to that, what advice do you have for founders?
Yeah, I would submit from a breach and incident response perspective, it's you don't want to have to make friends with all your key partners during a crisis, right? It's important to build those relationships. I call it, as a military analogy, train like you fight. Ensure that you, just what Caleb highlighted, ensuring that what are our run books, what are the plans that we need to have in place, whether that's, hey, how will isolate, segment, prevent, limit, mitigate blast radius, who do we need to partner with on our infrastructure partners, app teams, what are their app response and resiliency playbooks, whether that's air gap, solutions, whatever that case may be in that resiliency chain. I think it's all of those capabilities where the security team doesn't do it alone. It's in partnership with product teams, with infrastructure teams, and then teeing up your legal and your crisis communications. And do you bring in a retainer? It's understanding and walking through all of that. And the same with your management committee. We just put our CEO and management committee and our board through training this week, where we're just going through to, hey, what are the steps that we take so we don't have to try to make these critical decisions during a crisis? So I would submit it's just understanding of what is that end-to-end life cycle. And I can't hit on the head. Most of the tilt is in the identify and detect. And how do we ensure that we have a robust suite of capabilities, whether it's just, some of it might be just configuration, whether it's the right capabilities, solutions in the stack, all the way through recovery solutions and capabilities that extend beyond the security team. So I think we're starting to see a convergence of that end-to-end infrastructure there as well.
Sticking to this point around response, Bart asked a question, which is, I think, a very apt one. It's, do you use an external SOC or do you have your SOC internally? This is a growing kind of area. We're starting to see the creation of Expel as an external, MDR. Mandiant has obviously reaffirmed its focus around Mandiant Advantage, which is the XDR platform. How do the two of you think about it?
Sean, I'll let you go first.
Yeah. So I've had a mix of both in my previous organizations, and I think there's a polarity. You need to have folks that have your advanced. I call them my tier 3. Your tier 3 hunters, your tier 3 responders. There's nothing that beats having folks that are tuned to the environment, that know the environment, that can help detect, respond, and interdict. But when I think about tier 1, tier 2, and even some broader level monitoring, that's where I think it's beneficial to take advantage of other services that are out there and other capabilities. So you can start to, you don't want to bring in top talent and then they don't want to go and work tickets like the career builder monkeys, right? You want to have them focusing on really advanced and complex activities. So I'm a big fan of taking advantage of these platforms for just broader external monitoring, whether it's tier one management, whether they're VPNing in, whether it's anything else in your organization, and then more broadly using your internal folks for your advance, because they know the environment, they know the applications, they know the systems, they know the infrastructure in detail. So that's kind of how I look at that polarity.
Caleb?
Yeah, I mean, I'm similar in line. It's kind of interesting because, the entire goal, you see so many startups go after the, remove the analysts, right? Automation, ML, AI on all of these things. And I think everybody has learned pretty quickly, that doesn't work. We're not there yet. And at the end of the day, you're still spending a large amount of resources and time triaging and dealing with low-level alerts and problems. And to going to Sean's point, I don't want my people doing that, right? I would much rather my resources should be spent actively threat hunting, actively looking for advanced things, while we can have someone really managing some of these lower-level areas and issues. And I think things like Expel are pretty phenomenal. And offer really good value. And on top of that, I think Sean and I are just talking about enterprise-wide, but things like Expel are phenomenal for people who don't have big security teams, right? Because if you're looking at a small, medium business or a startup, they don't have anybody. And so having a service like that really extends the scope and allows these people to have good monitoring and good service when they don't have the headcount ability as well. So I think they're very beneficial.
Yeah. Just to add to Caleb's point, I would submit that the SMB space is probably the most underserved market that's being attacked the most. When we think about our own supply chains, it's these small either mom and pop to mid-size companies that are being owned, and they're using that as vector points to attack larger firms. But I think there's a huge opportunity for packaged capabilities that simplify it, where for people who have one IT person, you just simplify that by externalizing it. So I think there's some benefits, and hopefully we see a wave and focus on that segment.
Yeah, there's no question in my mind, security talent and people are so hard to come by, it needs to be wrapped up in a service. Right. The only way, and also going just to securing our nation, the only way we're going to do that better is by having some sort of service that a lot of these SMBs and mom and pops can use to get them into a better state. I'm 100%.
I completely agree. And for founders who are listening on the Open platform today, if you are building a company that's catering to SMBs, I'd love to hear from you. I've looked at a few different opportunities. Nothing has hit yet, but I agree 100% with Sean's point. I think that is an open gap, and there are not enough vendors focused on it. So it's a huge opportunity for innovation.
If we're talking about opportunities, if I were going to go start a company, I would also say I think respond and recovery is a really interesting and open space that's not very crowded, that I think at the end of the day, when the rubber meets the road, we're going to start seeing a lot of shift in focus on that. Yeah. So
100, I completely agree. If I were to double click a little bit, how would we think about, can we simplify resiliency on that recovery piece? Right now, you have you only really have a couple of big bucks players in that space. And the same when you think about a multi-cloud orchestration, if you think about whether it's, hey, most companies are anchoring on Coop. Hey, how do we can you simplify that orchestration? So even if it's just not the recovery itself, the ability to pivot and move to more flexible and resilient infrastructures, much easier than what we're seeing in the market today.
We're almost at time. I want to ask, and Caleb had asked me to be as controversial as possible. So I wanted to ask what I think is a pretty controversial question. Yesterday, we had Dmitry Alperovich of CrowdStrike and Guy Podjarny of SNCC with us. And there was an audience member who asked the question, as we were talking about tops down versus bottoms up sales. He said, do you think that this is the end of tops down sales in security, because the role of the developer is increasing? And Caleb, you talked a little bit about security engineering and your team focusing on that. I'd love to ask the two of you, and I'll give you Dimitri's answer too. He said tops down sales will end in 2030. He came up with that specific time. I still don't know how he came up with it. I need to go and call him about that. But I'd like to ask the two of you, do you think the role of the CISO will be eliminated at some point? And where do you think our industry is going? Is it just going to be a set of developers who will make a decision around security? Caleb?
Yeah, okay, so I think they're two separate topics, right? You're talking about top-down sales versus bottom-up sales. And then you're also talking about, does the role of the CISO go away or not, right? So these are two very, very different things. So I'm going to tackle the easiest one first, which is sales. Does top-down sales go away? I certainly hope so. And I think based on our conversation here, both, Sean and I were saying, don't target us. We're not the decision makers, right? At the end of the day, the organic growth and decision making through the organization is how these decisions are made. So effectively, does top-down sales go away? Yeah, I agree. I think it goes away, and it should go away. It doesn't make sense for us to be the ones that are forcing decisions. Sometimes we will, but a lot of the times we won't, right? And so I'm with that. The second one I'm going to leave because Sean, maybe I'll give you an option of which ones.
I'll take the latter one. Yeah, you hit on the head on the first one. For when I think about the evolving role, I actually am excited to see where it's come to date, and where I think it can continue to move toward. I think the role of the CIO is going to go away before the CISO role. Let me start with that. As infrastructure is like the light switch, like the light that I keep waving here in front of me. That's the sensor failing. But when I think about where the role has come from a back end, an engineer in a back room, all the way up to what we have now, where I think you see a dichotomy of CISOs, some that are governance tilted, some come from engineering governance and risk, some come from an engineering background. When I think about digital transformation and this, concept of shift left, of how do you ensure that you're moving security left? We've had to create and wedge in security, but when you think about quality code is secure code, and how do we ensure that we are enabling our engineering teams to have access, the ability to have rapid feedback, the ability to self-service. And then you just have guardrails on your pipelines. Hey, similar what we have. You publish anything. You try to publish anything that has X amount of risk to it. You break the build, and then there's rapid feedback and iteration. But I'm a big fan of this. Hey, you have NFRs, that's code. You have patterns that you can consume. You point to these OAuth services. You point to these encryption services, et cetera. And now you can simplify and self-service. I think the role will shift. I think in 10 years, my organization can be maybe a fraction of what it is, maybe a third of what it is now, because I don't need as much governance and administrative burden checks. And now it's a focused team of engineers that are building, ensuring everything's immutable, ephemeral, and self-service for the engineering teams.
We're out of time. For what it's worth, I don't think the role of the CISO will disappear on the second question. And the reason I don't think that is because the CEO will need somebody to blame when there's a major breach. So they need the two of you there.
why don't like VPs of engineering get blamed when they go down and fired? Like, I don't understand. Why is it only CISOs?
That is a completely different topic. And unfortunately, we're out of time. We could talk about that for another 30 more minutes. I have a point of view. But thank you so much, Sean and Caleb, for your time today. And thank you, everybody on the Hop-In platform, for listening in to us. We have one more talk that's up next. If you'll be able to find it in your menu pages, it's with the founder of Solana to talk a little bit about crypto and the fastest blockchain in the world. Thank you so much, Sean and Caleb.